We're going to skip ahead a little bit and talk about Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson became president in 1828, and he's often a symbol of the age of the common man. Right? When he became president, people came to the inauguration in huge amounts of numbers in a way that they had never done for inauguration before. Now, most presidents have a special inauguration dinner. This is still true. Jackson put a huge round of cheese that weighed about a ton that everyone could partake in. And so everyone was welcome to the White House to become part of the party. Didn't have tickets. There wasn't any cost. Anybody who wanted to come could come. And it was sort of a different kind of president. This was never seen before, right? Presidents before that, even Jefferson, held themselves a little bit apart from the common man. But Jackson absolutely refuses to do that. He was born in a log cabin, either in South Carolina or maybe Western Pennsylvania. It's unclear. But his father died from a work accident on a farm before Jackson. He had two older brothers, one of whom died in battle. He fought in the American Revolution when he was quite young, was a captive to the British, was beaten by a British soldier when he refused to clean his boots. He contracted smallpox, which killed his other brother. His mother was a nurse during the war. She contracted cholera and she died. So this leaves Andrew an orphan at the age of 14. Right? So he really was very young, a fighter in the Revolution. It's not actually clear if he was a fighter or a drummer or a fighter. Yet eventually he becomes a wealthy lawyer, so much so that he owns slaves of his own. And so many see him as the epitome of the American dream. And when we say the American dream, we mean that idea of being able to skip several social strata to go from being poor to being wealthy, right? The American dream is that America is a place where one can skip over a couple different strata and go from poor to rich. And this is an idea that has long been part of America and actually starts at this time period when the land is opening up and there seems to be a lot more opportunity. What we know, though, is that the probability that any one person will go from being poor to rich decreases over time, right? So in the early republic, there was a low chance. There was a chance, but there was a low chance of anyone becoming rich who was poor. Today, it's almost impossible. It's incredibly rare. In many ways, you have a better chance of winning the lottery than of skipping several stratas, and often that's the only way people do, right? And of course, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the rich have an increasingly large amount of the wealth. There's more inequality today, and there's quite a lot of inequality at the time of Jackson. But he was one of the few who was able to, in some way, become wealthy, even though he did not have much as a young person. Now, when he was orphaned, when his mom died at the age of 14, he was adopted by his grandfather, and his grandfather was wealthy, and so Jackson inherits. And so even though he comes from a poor background, he doesn't become wealthy from his own, necessarily his own work, right? He does inherit this wealth. But he also makes several smart moves, right? He gets training as a lawyer, right? There's lots of opportunities for law in the early republic. He moves to the frontier where there are not a lot of lawyers, and so there's a place with a lot of need for lawyers and opportunity, right? He moves to Nashville. Now, Nashville, Tennessee, Nashville is the state capital, it's a strong business center. And so Jackson represents rich people being sued by poor people over debts. So this guy gets some social mobility by promoting wealth, right? He's representing the rich people, and so he's in that network. He's also very shrewd, right? He serves in the War of 1812 because, of course, he hates the British from past experience. He has the ability and the inclination to kill Native Americans and the British. He kills several Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and of course he's instrumental to the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812 that made him so popular. And this is what starts his political campaign. Now, it doesn't count some problems. He marries a woman named Rachel Dawson, who's not yet legally divorced from her husband. So he's not officially married, but they live together and they act married. This is not very good for social circles. The wives snub Rachel and they expect their husbands to do so too. And so he ends up dueling a lot with the men whose wives snubbed his wife, right? And so he becomes very, very close to getting killed very times because duels are taking place at 8 paces, which is very short distance. He's not very good at this, but he's very determined, right? So he gets wounded quite often, and yet he survives, and he ends up becoming a senator in Tennessee. And eventually he gains the Democratic bid for president and becomes president in 1828. Now, his nickname by his enemies was Jackass, and Jackson liked it, and so he used it as his personal symbol. And here you see a cartoon of Jackson on a jackass, that is a donkey, right? This is then repopularized by the Democratic Party in the late 19th century, and that's how the symbol for the Democratic Party is a donkey. It's actually Jackass. The story about the Republican Party becoming an elephant, that's for another day. Now, he's a very popular president. He opposes anything man. And he's elected by a group of men who've just gotten the right to vote, right? It's a new state, they just have property, and so that's who elects him to be senator, and he gains that sort of popularity. And it's because there's a lot of people that can't own land, and so now that they can vote. And that's very exciting. Now, at some point, a lot of these states recognize that it's silly to make the distinction between people who have land and people who don't have land to vote, because everybody has land in a place like Tennessee, right? So they actually get rid of the voting requirements and say, come on out, you can vote even if you don't have land, right? And you can come get land. And that's a way to encourage a population to move to a place like Tennessee. So Andrew Jackson is elected in 1828 by a new broad-based electorate. A lot of people who had never been able to vote and get the job without special favors. Small government, no federal bank, and lower taxes, no money for internal improvements. Just, states can do internal improvements, and the end of banks and speculation. So what does that mean? Well, banks and speculation were tied hand in hand. The idea was that banks borrow your money and then they speculate. They invested in something that may or may not be risky, right? And that's what a bank does. That you put your money into a bank, they take that money as a loan and they invest it in something else to then make money off of you, right? And Jackson hated this process because a lot of banks were speculating in a lot of these new developments that may not pan out, and Jackson had actually spent a lot of his own money on a bank, and he had lost it all, right? And so he sees this as one of the major problems that's going to hurt the common man, are banks and creditors in general. And one of the things that Jackson does is he gets rid of the National Bank, right? And this is a cartoon of him fighting off the sort of the dragon of speculation and banks as it are. Now, he does go through a couple other fights during his presidency. One is called the nullification crisis, right? And this has to do with Jackson's overall reluctance to increase federal power, right? He doesn't want to have a big government, but he imposes a tax, it's called the Tariff of 1828. It's a tax on wool and iron, right? And this is generally a tax to protect northern manufacturing, who make wool and iron products. And there's a lot of opposition in the South to this tax, right? It's a tax that they can't afford. They have to buy all their wool and iron because the only thing that they make is cotton, right? So they threaten to nullify the law, right? So this is led by a senator named John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And the theory behind nullification is that a state can take a stand against a federal law when it tramples on their rights and interests, right? So John C. Calhoun says, you make a federal law that tramples on South Carolina's interests, so we're going to basically veto that law for South Carolina. Jackson sees the nullification as a form of secession, right, that he's going to threaten disunion. And it comes to a head in 1832. But in the end, Jackson reduces the tax, and South Carolina backs down on nullification. So they come to an agreement. The last two things that are part of Jackson's presidency that are important for his legacy is one, Indian removal, right? He passes the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forcibly moves Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole to lands west of the Mississippi, because states want that land for growing cotton, and the federal government won't stand in their way, right? The Supreme Court argues that Native Americans should be given federal protection, but Jackson replies, well, if you want to make that decision, that's fine, but you'll have to enforce it. The Cherokee tribe passive resistance until Jackson sends troops to move 18,000 people westward. A quarter of them die on the Trail of Tears. The last aspect of Jackson's presidency is the end of the bank. There's a panic in 1837, and so he decides that there's a run on the bank in 1837. He says that's it. There's too much speculation, and he ends the bank, which makes his presence on the $20 bill, which is now going away, but that was an item of irony as well as misfortunate.